For over 38 months, Russia has been waging war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I am Julian Rupke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start again with the civilian vehicles that Russia is increasingly using, not only for logistics behind the front lines, but also for direct assaults on Ukrainian positions. We are looking at new footage from the Ukrainian army, or rather first from the Russian army. And here we see how these vehicles are set up. That is, these are actually vehicles with 2 seats, essentially just pickups. What we see here now are 3 soldiers in the front and I think 2 soldiers in the back. Hard to tell. Sometimes it's 3 or 4. That means it's an extremely packed small civilian vehicle with this little net in between, and that's supposed to make it somehow work. The idea being to escape Ukrainian drones. Right now, however, we're seeing new Ukrainian footage, meaning fresh video material, which clearly demonstrates that these small civilian vehicles are actually extremely dangerous. They're basically moving coffins for Russian troops, offering no protection. There is no armor, and we just saw that, the impact first from the perspective of the Ukrainian drone. Here is the vehicle, and then this massive fireball, meaning the tank is hit almost instantly, and the ammunition or fuel is struck as well, igniting rapidly. That is being transported by the very first explosion. And that leads to, as we see here, there being massive damage repeatedly, and we must also consider the dead who are lying right beside it. Then we pixelate, because very often it's the case that this first impact, especially if it's a BMP, for example, often leads to the fact that afterwards, well, perhaps with a concussion or minor injuries, but the soldiers managed to come out of it relatively unscathed. It's entirely different with these attacks. There are immediate shrapnel damages causing shrapnel injuries for every single soldier present on the scene. And we see the problem here. Here we see another one of these vehicles, which symbolically represents what Russia thinks one should have instead of the armor and instead of the mounted automatic machine guns and so on in the BTR-82A. What they take instead, namely a single soldier who sits, or in this case stands on top of all the supplies and keeps firing at the drone the entire time. That usually doesn't help at all, but 90% of the drones still hit their target even when they're being shot at the entire time. And those are the results we end up seeing. Relatively often here in the split screen, one side shows the drone's impact, the other another view. The split screen ensures clarity and accuracy. And I'll let the whole thing run, because you can see it's really the absolute mass and the absolute majority of the attacks or supply runs that the Russians are carrying out now, which are being carried out with such civilian vehicles here. Again, we see it. The Ukrainians want to make sure. The small drone, the FPV drone, is moving once more and will shortly fly in here to ensure without a doubt that this vehicle, and as we can clearly observe, the jammer mounted on top of it, also it didn't work here either. Here we can also see relatively well, so here's the jammer with the large antennas. That it just doesn't work anymore. That's why the Ukrainians play it safe and keep flying in there again and again. In the end, we see footage we've never seen before. It seems the Russians are now not only using civilian pickups, but, and this is truly unbelievable, here's a school bus. At least it looks like a school bus. It's a large bus, a yellow bus that's been taken to drive across open fields near the front. Here's another shot, and the color is clearly visible. It's definitely a yellowish tone. And this vehicle, as we can see here, is being utilized by the Russian military to move across open fields close to the front line. Whether it's a logistics mission or a direct movement toward the front lines aimed at a Ukrainian position, that remains uncertain at this time. However, for the very first time, we are witnessing a large bus, most likely even a school bus, being utilized by Russian forces to storm and assault a position. What we haven't seen at all in this footage, and what we're seeing less and less of in the material, are armored vehicles like infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and so on. But we see such vehicles that have absolutely become the norm by now when it comes to how Russia is advancing. Another video on this topic we'd like to watch, where we'll see not cars but motorcycles. We've already talked about these as well, and here you can once again see just how little protection these motorcycles actually provide. 2 Russian motorcyclists are spotted. Their location is concerning for Ukraine, possibly signaling reconnaissance. Their agility in tough terrain raises alarms. These are 2 motorcycles moving through Sumy, and now we see that within just a few seconds, let me step aside, within just a few seconds, the 2 are racing side by side. Both, and here we see the first or the second, each of them triggering a mine as they continue moving forward. That also means the whole idea of driving side by side. The idea that you ride a motorcycle, you go fast, you ride next to each other, that just doesn't work at all. That's not at all what soldiers learn. Instead, you naturally try to drive in a straight line one after another, especially in unfamiliar terrain, so that if the first one hits a mine, the second avoids the nearby mine and can stop. Let's replay it briefly. It's clear, and we'll pixelate it right away. Here as well, 2 expositions at once. which now have led to the death of likely 4 soldiers on it. And there's another video as well which doesn't depict the exact scene, but rather a very similar one. Once again, here we can clearly observe a motorcycle belonging to the army of the Russian Federation. Here we see it. And this one also drives directly over a mine, again, of course, pixelated, which inevitably results in the death of 1 or 2 occupants here. I just mentioned it, we need to take a closer look at the location, specifically the exact area where this incident just occurred, namely in the Sumy region. And that is quite alarming for Ukraine because it appears as though the Russians up here, the map is a bit outdated, are advancing further in this area. Until now, we had the situation where Basivka and another very small village up here were under Russian control. However, the footage just shown was captured near this small lake here, not far from Lochnia. Yes, that means the Russians have advanced here. If you take a closer look, about 4 kilometers, 5 kilometers further in. According to multiple sources today, there are reports that fighting is also taking place around Lochnia. That would be relatively bad for the Ukrainians, as it would not only further jeopardize the supply line to Kursk, but also complicate their overall logistics. Close, Ukrainians have little left in Kursk, critical situation developing. That means there are not as many units left to supply, and perhaps it's done through forests and fields now rather than the main road. The supply situation here becomes more difficult. The remaining units in Kursk and, well, Yanukivka is a very important location, a large village with over 2,000 inhabitants in the past, where the Ukrainians had stationed their entire logistics in the region. Meanwhile, we can see fighting happening about 4 kilometers north of Junakivka. We've seen it with the motorcycles. The Russians are clearly serious about what they're capable of achieving here. This is not the major offensive. These are still small tanks and armored vehicles moving into Sumy. But these are the typical images we're familiar with of small, unarmored, primarily infantry assaults, in this specific instance conducted using unarmored motorcycles. Nevertheless, they're steadily advancing further and deeper into the Sumy region with this approach. Ukraine is deploying its drones not only against Russian vehicles, but also, and more significantly, against Russian army positions. And here we witness a precise strike by the Ukrainians. We can clearly observe here that a rotation has occurred in a village within Ukraine that's occupied by Russia, and we can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 soldiers at the very least who have just gathered together here. That means most likely a position has just been re-equipped with a new vehicle, which arrives there and delivers both food and, as we'll see in a moment, fuel. And that is, we hope, it's still visible, that's the position where all the soldiers were just now. Meanwhile, they have entered the house, and the vehicle that just arrived is parked here at this supply point. However, as mentioned, the Ukrainians were observing the whole situation, and we now see the impact on this vehicle culminating in a very large explosion. We can see that it's not necessarily ammunition, but primarily fuel that is currently burning here. And the entire situation is particularly negative for the Russians in the sense that it's not solely their soldiers who are affected here. We can see some of them fleeing now, their position has been exposed, and their supply lines here have been destroyed. So another victory for the Ukrainian forces here, though it's just against a small unit in this particular village. Nonetheless, we're witnessing the drones that, as President Zelensky has noted, are now responsible for 75% of Russia's manpower losses. It's not artillery or machine guns anymore, but rather small kamikaze drones handling it. These drones have caused considerable damage in this village, significantly weakening the Russians and undermining their position. One final video focusing on Ukrainian drones before we shift over to the Russian side with the material we'll review. And this demonstrates that these drones are not solely employed to kill, but also utilized to capture Russian forces. We can see it here, footage of a Russian soldier who was likely targeted numerous times by a drone, either through a direct kamikaze strike or by the repeated dropping of explosive grenades. He's fighting for his life, he's saying, "I can't take it anymore, please stop, I want it to end." And the Ukrainians are actually giving him the chance to survive and escape. Not to die here, but we see it now. A DJI Mavic drone from the Ukrainian army guiding him to safety and rescue. And it's guiding him from where he currently is. We can see here he's marked toward the Ukrainian position, which means he's moving here, maybe 1 or 2 kilometers along the front line, or even crossing over it entirely. The Ukrainians know at that moment that they don't want to and shouldn't attack him. And here we see it, that he ultimately succeeds in reaching the Ukrainian position, making it to a village. Here we see it, the Russian is now positioned here, the Ukrainian is steadily advancing towards him, and now he's being disarmed and subsequently taken prisoner. This Russian has managed to survive this mission at least. He's now being taken prisoner and is entering what's known as exchange fund, the captivity that is for soldiers, both on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, which has been established, so to speak. Both sides actually say this to organize the exchange process smoothly later on. The issue for captured Russian soldiers, especially if their identity is known, we've blurred it, is they're quickly sent back to the front by Russia if they're exchanged. So this soldier's ordeal is only temporarily paused, far from being truly resolved or brought to an end. Yet he will most likely continue fighting for Russia afterward. And we also know from Russian deserters that there is a harsh and severe punishment for it. So you end up back in the assault troops, sent to the absolute front lines, the so-called one-way missions, meaning suicide missions, where you either make it or you die. If you had previously surrendered to the Ukrainians. After Ukrainian attacks, we want to shift the focus to Russian attacks. Here as well, there are numerous new videos. The Russians have been active using, for example, a Lancet drone. In this instance, a Lancet kamikaze drone. As it approaches, we can now take a closer look of the incoming Lancet drone. With a range of approximately 70 kilometers, targeting a Ukrainian T-64 tank that was delayed in retreat. And he's hiding here, was hit here just now, and the interesting thing is that we're now seeing a second attack on this tank. And this second attack isn't from a Lancet, but from an FPV kamikaze drone. This means that the tank here was located near the city of Lyman, where fighting is currently concentrated at the center of the Donetsk front between both sides. Just 4 kilometers from the front, it was spotted. Still, the Russians used the Lancet first. We are now deploying an FPV kamikaze drone in this area after it had already been damaged to ensure it is completely destroyed. This is a fairly new phenomenon, medium-range drones reaching 70 kilometers and these small FPV kamikaze drones maxing out at just 10 kilometers are being used together to attack Ukrainian units. However, it's not just this one vehicle that was attacked, but we also have a new video, again from Sumy, showing that the Russians currently hold a significant and strong interest in Sumy. We've observed them advancing gradually, having already secured control of around 4 to 5 villages in Sumy in the northeast of the country. And for that process to keep functioning so that they can indeed painstakingly advance step by step, Ukrainian radar systems are being systematically destroyed. Here we observe another target that has been detected, situated approximately 20 kilometers from the Russian border. And here we once again observe the deployment of a Lancet drone by the Russian military forces to strike this radar system. We're seeing the approach now, it's always quite poor quality. Nonetheless, the entire scene is also being filmed by a surveillance drone overhead. That means we can be relatively certain that at this moment, the Lancet has hit and struck this radar system. That means we're not only seeing the Ukrainian drones, but of course the Russians as well, who are doing so in an increasingly intensive manner. These Lancets that we just saw, the small FPVs that we saw, but also the fiber optic drones, meanwhile, are now being produced in Russia by the thousands. Zerenia, manufactured in factories or industrially by the defense industry and delivered to Ukraine every day, every hour, to continue carrying out widespread destruction efforts here. The Russians are deploying not just Lancet-type medium-range drones, but also a wide range of long-range drones. The Geren 1 and Geren 2 drones, which are essentially large kamikaze models with a range of 800 kilometers, are accompanied by decoy drones specifically designed to distract Ukraine, which are supposed to signal, yes, now 100 drones are approaching, we have to shoot down all 100, but in reality, out of those 100, maybe only 30 are actually armed, and specifically Geren 1 and Geren 2, while others correspond to the Gerbera type. We've seen or hear parody. Russians call this drone parody, a decoy drone, if you will. It's unarmed, flying alongside the Geren 1 and Geren 2 towards Ukraine, only to crash somewhere without exploding or causing any detonation whatsoever. It's all just to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense. We've already got these recordings from last December showing how it appears when it crashes in a fairly intact state without much damage. Here's a new recording. It's very interesting because it clearly reveals there's already high tech inside by now. So we're not just seeing the battery pack, but we're also seeing a 2-stroke engine that's installed here. We see here that this drone is built from pressed wood. It's not bad at all, as Ukrainian soldiers have told us, but rather quite good, because it makes it even harder to locate them with radar. And that's the special part. We're now seeing a very modern 4G modem installed inside by the Russians. Here we see it. Now we see it right here. A 4G modem that has been installed inside, specifically configured and carefully set up with a Kyivstar SIM card embedded. And Kyivstar is a Ukrainian provider. That means the Russians are using Ukrainian mobile networks to control these drones, to move from point A to point B, for example, between the different cell towers. And potentially, it's still not entirely clear, they might also be using it to transmit live footage in real time. That is, to transmit the positional data and perhaps also videos from these drones. which can be controlled even better with it. That means the whole thing is quite terrifying for the Ukrainians, their own civilian infrastructure alongside these private providers. Here we see it again. So that's a real modem with a real internet cable on the right side. Their own providers are being used by the Russians against them to move from point A to point B within Ukraine and then travel hundreds of kilometers within the country, either to strike with Geran 2 drones or, like this parody drone, to simply crash somewhere without causing any damage. Next, we want to turn our attention to a relatively rare phenomenon, namely the use of a HIMARS artillery system by the Ukrainian army. At least it has become rare, especially when compared to the videos we used to see a year or 2 years ago. We've just received a new video from Ukraine revealing that a D-30 artillery piece, specifically a 122mm howitzer belonging to the Russian army, has been spotted in this area, and now an M142. HIMARS is being deployed. Here we see it. The explosion occurs above it. And we'll now also see how the ammunition of the D-30 ends up exploding afterward. That means there are secondary explosions. So it's safe to assume that either the artillery piece itself or the ammunition stored around it has actually been destroyed. And why have these videos become so rare? There are 2 or 3 possible answers for that. The first possible answer is, of course, OPSEC. That means the Ukrainians are simply posting less of it to avoid showing the Russians where they have HIMARS deployed. The second possibility is, as we've seen in recent weeks, that the Russians have actually destroyed some of the HIMARS launchers, or at least severely damaged them in recent months. There were sometimes more videos of those than of HIMARS attacks. And the third possibility, of course, is that there is no longer enough ammunition. This means we know that this ammunition came exclusively from the USA, at least it was produced there, and that has been the case since President Trump has been in office. No new ammunition for the HIMARS is being delivered anymore. This means it's possible that remaining stocks, which Biden pledged, might have already been or will gradually be delivered over time. What is relatively clear, or what is 100% clear, is that President Trump has not pledged any new HIMARS missiles. And so Ukraine has to manage very carefully, because there are fewer and fewer missiles available to them. Ukraine also has to manage its air-to-ground ordnance sparingly. However, they have a significant advantage here, as not only the US provides these, but France does as well. In that regard, we're looking at 2 videos of recent operations by the Ukrainian Air Force. The first video shows us once again a significant Russian position in the southern part of the country. And here several bunker facilities within the position have been spotted and mapped out, and now we're about to see a MiG-29 in action, which overall, if I'm not mistaken, is releasing 4 small GBU-39 bombs from the USA right here. We're seeing the whole thing now. As I said, these are the 4 positions that are supposed to be hit. There, they aim to hit these 4 bunker facilities, and we'll see it in a moment. 3 of the targets are hit with remarkable precision, while 1 misses by a few meters, specifically the one on the far left. Let's take a look now. The impacts within just a few seconds. They were all dropped at the same time. These are all guided glide bombs, and as we can see, only here on the left side is the position still visible afterwards, and the explosion occurred a bit behind it. All the other 3 positions were hit precisely by this bomb. And as mentioned, the GBU-39 is one of the glide bombs that Ukraine has received. They're believed to have obtained hundreds or possibly even thousands, ensuring they can be used for months or even years into the future. However, we also see that these GBU-39s at 250 pounds or just 129 kilos are extremely lightweight. That only a certain portion of it is, of course, explosive, and that's why we see very, very small explosions. So it's suitable for targeted strikes, precision strikes, but not when you're up against, as we just saw, someone who's building such massive trench systems there. Twice as heavy as the ASM-250 from France, and this bomb is also employed by Ukraine using their own MiG-29. But specifically against larger targets, and that's exactly what we're seeing here now. On one hand, we have position again in the south of the country, I believe in the Kherson region, if I'm not mistaken, which is initially being monitored by a Shark drone from the Ukrainian army. And now we're about to see the various impacts. It's always just 2. That means here we see 2 impacts right into these. There was the first one, there was the second one, into these barracks belonging to the Russian army, or at least into these facilities used by the Russians. And we can clearly observe that these are significantly larger explosions, which are quite noticeable here. Yet these bombs are deployed not only in the south, but also in the east. Now we're looking again at the Kursk region. Here we see it, Kursk, with one of the towns, namely Chotkino, located directly on the border. And that's a major problem for the Russians, particularly because Chotkino is situated just 1 kilometer away from the border. A relatively large town, quite industrially developed, where the Russians naturally store much of their logistics, their bombs, and continue to pose a significant and ongoing threat, which are intended for use in Sumy or to target it. For Ukraine, attacking these is relatively simple, as they're located just behind the border and the front lines, and here we can clearly observe that this factory building is struck by two separate and distinct explosions. That was the first and the second. Now again from a different perspective, so this is the first and the second right after. Both hit the building directly, causing severe damage. That means these are the French glide bombs, the so-called hammer bombs, provided by President Macron. Allegedly, according to at least the official data, France delivers 50 of them per month. As long as Ukraine still has delivery systems like the MiG-29 to carry these bombs, it remains fully capable, especially since Russia is unable to attack and destroy the hidden airfields in western Ukraine. Ukraine remains capable of conducting airstrikes against the Russian occupiers on an almost daily basis, maintaining significant pressure.